Commissioner, in my experience in the public service, it is almost always a stuff-up. I cannot think of any examples where a conspiracy has been concocted by people to do something deliberately.
Okay, what about conspiracy to conceal stuff up?
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. In 2019, after 3 years, Robodebt was found to be unlawful. Through the Royal Commission process, we've found it was also immoral and wildly inaccurate. Ultimately, the Australian government was forced to pay $1.8 billion back to more than 470,000 Australians. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright, and I am here with my fellow South Australian public servant, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And recovering public servant, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
Last episode, we heard about some of the difficulties that DSS had as a senior agency in getting its fundamental concerns about the Robodebt program addressed by DHS. This episode, we're going to focus more on what DSS did once they realised that either DHS had misled them, or perhaps more generously, that there had just been a grave misunderstanding. This episode is really about the test and what tests being collegiate as agencies. So, Caroline, can you give us a bit of a recap of where we're up to?
So we've heard about how in late 2014, when DHS drafted the proposal, DSS Senior Policy Agency had serious concerns, and they went off and they got this legal advice that said income averaging was unlawful. 1 week before the MPP is lodged in March 2015...
The MPP being the budget bid?
Yes, thank you. 1 week before the budget bid is lodged in March 2015, there's a meeting where DHS changed that proposal to say no change to income assessment processes, meaning no legislative change required. And the two agencies leave that meeting with really different understandings of what's going on. DSS think, they're not going to progress the original proposal, they're going to change it. DHS think, DSS now understand that we've always averaged, and so it's fine, we're going to crack on with what we proposed.
Right, so one agency thinks no ledge change means we're not averaging, and one agency thinks no ledge change is required because we've always used averaging.
Well summarised. And that's pretty much where it lays from DSS's perspective until late 2016, when they start hearing things in the media, and then early 2017 they get this notice about an Ombudsman report. And look, the DSS narrative is that they are gobsmacked to hear that averaging is happening, right? Actually, there is some evidence that DSS saw some things along the way about the proposal. There was, in fact, a MyEFO budget submission in late 2015 that added in more years of debt recovery. There was a presentation to a DHS DSS payments forum in early 2016 where there's a PowerPoint that shows that averaging is happening. But DSS take the view that they didn't pay much attention to this stuff going on because they were really confident in the assurances that they were being provided that no averaging was happening. So let's have a listen to what Serena Wilson, the DepSec at DSS, says about why she didn't follow up after early 2015 to make sure that DHS were in fact changing what they were doing and weren't going to be using averaging.
Can I just ask you before we go on, Ms Golightly had really sidelined you, kept you out of the dealings in relation to the executive minute. Why would you take her word for it that there was no change without wanting details of how they were going to do this?
I ask myself that now, Commissioner. I had a lot of other responsibilities. I believe that they understood our position and got it. I've seen in preparing for this hearing that my staff had additional further discussions with DHS after the executive minute came back from Minister Morrison, and I understood that they had been reassured as well. And I had no reason to believe that she would be untruthful or deliberately not carry through with the assurances that I've been provided with.
It does look as if you may all have found it just easier to accept the assurance and not look too deeply.
Commissioner, it was a separate department, and it was not an environment that institutionally or culturally encouraged us to get up in in DHS's business. And so I did accept and I did believe the assurances that I was given. In hindsight, I wish I hadn't.
So what do we reckon stopped them from looking too hard to check that someone else was following through on the thing they thought they had agreed?
So I think that there's a human and an institutional answer. So I think some of the human answers are like, you're very busy. It's not my KPI. It's someone else's.
Indeed.
So if I've got 10 things to do today and time to do 7, that's not going to be one of them. I think they had to work together on a range of issues, and because they had to do that, effectively it's an accusation in some ways. And so to make an accusation like that could jeopardise the relationship and all the other programs that they are running, developing, building together. I just think there's another human part of it, which is, what if I'm wrong? Like, to make a big, I think you're doing something we agreed you wouldn't do, or I believe we agreed you wouldn't do. And to be wrong in that is not just career limiting, it's just embarrassing and humiliating. And so you've got these assurances and you're very busy, and then you have to risk taking skin off yourself and you could be wrong. I don't excuse it, but I can really see what the environment that made them behave like that was.
Oh, just so comprehensively. And I think, there's something, as you say, it feels like an accusation, because what you can say is, oh, hey, DHS, we're just checking in on the implementation of that thing we agreed about. Since when does anyone look over your shoulder and check your homework, right?
Exactly.
Like, it's really uncommon in government for another agency to come and check in on what you're doing, even if it is kind of shared business.
Well, but also because I think you're operating from a good faith premise, right? Which is that you shouldn't need to go in and check, because we're all operating in good faith that you're doing the bit you said you would do that we agreed.
But that gets back to the fact that there was an agreed language. Like, they left those early meetings and those early advices, etc., with these different, what ledge change meant. So we have to have common language and really clear common ways of agreeing to those things, Alison, otherwise this happens. So it should be a good faith. You never want to end up in a world where you're not operating with your colleagues across other agencies, not in good faith.
Exactly.
But for that to work, when we get to these kind of prickly, do we have enough money? This ledge change required. Who's paying for the widgets?
Who's paying for it is often one review.
Where you leave the meeting and you were really sure that the other agency was paying for the widgets, but it turns out that everyone felt differently. Those things are the bedrock of getting it right. And after you've got that right, you should be able to do exactly I'm not checking up on someone else's homework.
But it is really hard, isn't it? Like, I always think there's something about the kind of low power way of doing this. Like, I've worked in an agency where it was really challenging to go and talk about what was happening in your neighbouring division's business. And I always had to start those conversations with, look, I'm sure I'm wrong. I'm sure I'm just too stupid to understand what this is, but could you maybe just explain it to me in your terms so I can make sure we're on the same page? Yeah. But not everyone is as willing to kind of roll in the mud and show their belly in that way. Like, that's quite a particular
And I'd also say
thing.
that's a gendered thing, to be honest, Caroline. Like, I've not seen many male executives be prepared to go in. I use that strategy all the time.
Yeah.
Could be me. Maybe I completely misunderstood.
And sometimes it is, right?
And every now and then it is. But I think that's
so true.
A slightly gendered way of trying to get into a space where you think you can add value that I see women do more than men.
There was that tweet the other day that said, no one understands something more comprehensively than a woman who asks in a meeting, just so I understand.
Exactly, right?
I think there's also something gendered about this in the idea of women being busybodies and fiddling in other people's business. Like, I really feel there's something challenging about being a woman and doing that interfering than it is being a man and doing that interfering. And I'm mindful of, we might talk about this a bit later, but, the FAS in DHS, Mark Withnell, I think he's from a military background, and he talks about, we know boats and we know blah, blah, blah. And going along to someone like that, it's like, you can just, maybe I am stereotyping and grossly exaggerating, but I can feel his kind of contempt for my lady interest.
Yeah. And so here's another weird theory. I once worked in a place where they had in the waiting room a bundle of old minutes and documentation from the department from the 1920s. right? And it was shocking how little correspondence, but how precise that correspondence was when you had to actually, transcribe it by hand or eventually use a typewriter. Could they have overcome this if they minuted their agreement?
That's what I was getting at with that bedrock bit, right? Like, once you get that right, then you can leave. Also, I didn't know that existed, and if I win lotto, I want to sit there with the 19-20 minutes of meetings from public service. That sounds like my way to spend my retirement.
The minutes are like a page and a half long.
That is fantastic. Yeah.
Anyway, so what happens when DSS find out that averaging is happening and they thought it wasn't?
So there's this media storm, and it's fair to say that DSS are pissed. They are absolutely pissed. They all variously use this language like, we were surprised, and then it's, we were very surprised, and then Serena Wilson actually says, I was peeved.
Peeved is public service for swearing, right?
Yeah,
like peeved.
Is, yeah, I am going to kill someone. So DSS go off and they do some internal examination. They're like, we thought we killed this in early 2015, and here we are in early 2017, and suddenly it's like they're using averaging. So they go off and they work out, what advice did we give, blah, blah, blah. They find their 2014 legal advice that says it's unlawful. And instead of handing that legal advice over to the Ombudsman, they commission new legal advice that says that actually averaging is lawful in a very technical set of circumstances that, the lawyer eventually admits to the Royal Commission is so obscure it's not even like a realistic proposition. So they engage in a cover-up.
Yeah.
Yeah. They do ask some questions in the background, and they're reassured, or in fact they're lied to, where they're told, look, it's only happening as a last resort. Actually, DHS know that 2/3 of letter recipients aren't writing back, and so it's there. But DSS, they do this work in the background to work out what's happening, but when they talk to the Ombudsman, for example, they use DHS's talking points. They use talking points that assert legality before they have the second piece of legal advice. So when they only know it's illegal, they say to the Ombudsman, it's legal. They have talking points to the Minister saying it's legal. They engage in this incredible kind of... It's like it's so awkward that they've discovered it was wrong. It's like when you see someone wearing a really ugly dress and you say, oh, fabulous dress. They're like, oh, fabulous legal program. That's what they do.
So, because they have a moment here, right? There's a moment in time, they're pissed. Peeved. They're peeved. And and the Ombudsman is investigating.
Yep.
And instead of saying to the Ombudsman, hold up, this is not what we thought was happening, moreover, our advice has always been that wasn't legal.
Yep.
They slid in behind the agency at whom they were peeved.
Yep.
And just adopted their talking points and then went and commissioned legal advice to back that up.
And not only that, their engagement with the Ombudsman is so disingenuous. At various times, the Ombudsman asks them for legal advice. They don't send the 2014 advice until asked twice for it. They put all this... They write a letter in response to the Ombudsman's first report in the end where they say it's very nice to see that the Ombudsman has found it was legal. The Ombudsman didn't find it was legal. And that letter is relied upon by DHS for the next 3 years.
And the Minister, if I remember correctly.
Absolutely. They're like, well, the agency, DSS, the senior policy agency, said it was legal in this letter. That's what it is. So they back it in so comprehensively. I think one of the interesting things is that as the Royal Commission has examined who was drafting all of this, it's like these... No offence, but one of them in particular strikes you as a moron junior burger who is confronted with all this conflicting information and he assumes that there is some solution for it and so he constructs it.
I mean, it strikes me as an absolute moral and ethical failure at that moment in time.
I really struggle with this bit of it. So there are lots of parts of this where certain things seem kind of well-intentioned and then terribly executed, and structural reasons why these things didn't work and why we didn't hear from junior burgers or whatever else. This one just seems like the very moment where it's incredibly poor leadership and governance and that you would leave something this complex and risky to a junior person and that there wasn't... Like, I saw no evidence, Caroline, in this part of it that there was, like, the crisis meeting that the secretary and the FAS and a couple of, you know, content experts got in the room and said, whoa, what's going on here? Sorry, could we step this out from the beginning?
Wow.
I just get the sense it was more, how do I get rid of it? What do I write next to stay out of this?
So I know you are busily constructing an episode, I think, on exactly this theme. One of the things that's happening here is it's on Christmas holidays. And so you've got a whole bunch of people acting up. So the person who commissions the inquiry into working out what was happening.
So much of Robodebt happened in Christmas holidays between 2014 and 2019.
Yeah.
It's quite shocking how much something blew up and what you were left with was enacting. And I am wanting to talk about it further, but this is yet another example of how someone's like, I've got no background.
Yeah, I assume everyone's done the right thing. That's, they start with this assumption that competence has been had, and then they're like, oh, sugar, I better, like, compile a story that makes it
make sense.
Yeah,
wow.
They're sense-making.
And so what were their obligations, do we think, or, like, how is it that when, at this moment when things went wrong, particularly went wrong as between two different agencies, how is it that one agency just towed the line?
There's something about the minister, I think, and actually it's a different minister. So it's not, I don't mean that I think the minister directed the agencies to toe the line. I think there is something about feeling on the hook for supporting the ministers. I really think there's something about the fact that the ministers and the PM had already come out and said quite strongly that they backed in the program and everything was fine. So there's a kind of, oh, right, we've got a whole bunch of people
Can't land my minister in it.
Yeah, and it was their minister, because actually Minister for Human Services Tudge was on leave. So again, we have an acting minister, Minister Christian Porter, who's the Minister for Social Services. So he's their minister, and he's been out in the media defending this scheme. So there's this kind of like defensive thing going on. That definitely for me was part of it. I don't know.
I think that I'm a big fan of the Westminster system in almost every way, but I'm starting to feel like it doesn't reflect modern governance in one particular way, which is this issue of reporting up as a junior person to a senior person to a secretary to a minister. And that is your line of hierarchical accountability, and someone else's line in another department is up through a similar line. And so it is not built for collegiality at all.
Other than between cabinet ministers.
I'm not quite sure, like post-Reformation, whether that was fine. I'm not sure what their bureau, I'm not sure what kind of social security systems they had, but.
And maybe in a less complex world it mattered less.
But it doesn't now.
Yeah. Maybe there was clearer definition about what belonged to each minister and what belonged to each department.
But this is like the only moment where they are collegiate, or not necessarily collegiate, but what I find really odd is the whole time that they're building it, they're going up through two silos, which is exactly how the system is built. And then at the one moment where that system could have worked would have been briefing up through DSS to the DSS minister to say, this is not working and here are all our reasons. And that was the one moment they decided to back each other in and work together.
So right, Danielle. Like, that's why I think I've titled this episode Faux Collegiality, because there is no collegiality between the departments along this process. But when they get to this point where the back is against the wall, where the ministers are against the wall, they do this thing where they engage in a cover-up. And it's that, like, that's a faux collegiality, right? Like,
yeah.
And I think many of the witnesses later say things like, well, actually, I suspect the minister would have liked to have known that it was illegal rather than carrying on and doing a thing. But they felt backed into a corner at that moment to have solidarity, and they did it.
Yeah.
And that was it.
So in some ways, the moment with which operating on your own and with your own minister and in a silo, the moment to do that was then.
Yep.
And that's the only time they didn't do it.
Absolutely. And I think what's so fascinating is that while DSS are engaging in this kind of soft cover-up, At the same time, in DHS, if they had looked over and if they'd talked to their counterparts at DHS, they would have realised that this project in DHS was one of the kind of stinkiest projects going around. It was being run in the compliance division as a silo. The ICT people hate it. The media people hated it. Everyone thought it was being done really badly in DHS.
Wow.
But then DSS is like covering it up as though it's all fine. And in DHS, they're like, oh my God, this thing is terrible. We need to fix it. So there's this real disconnection between the two. And part of that, of course, is that culture of DHS where they're all too frightened to say to anyone outside of the agency,
what if we stuff this up?
Yeah, exactly right.
I think the other thing I notice is, and I don't have a map as clearly in my head, I think, as you do, Caroline, is there's lots of people moving between the agencies as well, being promoted out of DHS into a more senior role at DSS. And I think that there's a potential that it seems to me, even when you look at where some of the people ended up now, that in the Commonwealth Public Service, and I'm not sure what I think about different state public services, but there's kind of streams, particularly for senior people. So you move around, but you move around in the social services or in the economic portfolios or in the, those kinds of things, which means that for people who are ambitious, this collegiateness is also a part of career progression, which is my next job will be
there.
Well, my next job, if I'm in DHS, is probably going to be DSS or NDIS. Like I'm in the stream where there's only a certain number of places I can work. And so if I go around tapping on shoulders saying, I think you've done all your stuff wrong, I'm kind of like looking forward to sitting across from them in an interview in a year's time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good
Especially if it turns out that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that then kind of underlies a culture where there's a lack of curiosity and an unwillingness to step back and say, what if we were doing this wrong the whole time? And so what was happening in DHS is going to be the subject of our next episode. Till next time.
This podcast was recorded on Kaurna land, and we recognise Kaurna elders past and present. Always was, always will be. Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. If you want rigorous reporting on Robodebt, we recommend the work of Rick Morton at the Saturday paper, Chris Nouse and Luke Henrique Gomez at The Guardian, Ben Eltham at Crikey, and of course, the Robodebt Royal Commission itself. The first 8 episodes were recorded before the Royal Commission launched its final report, and so don't benefit from the great wisdom of Commissioner Holmes. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions, or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.